I would think very highly about subsidized training. I could tell you as a CEO that would get my interest piqued because I would like the capability as a CEO to dedicate certain training programs that we already have in-house to veterans, and it's always an issue of cost. So some sort of subsidization there. The last thing I'd like to suggest to you, based on my own experiences, I think you have a lesser problem with officers, a lesser problem with skill sets or specialties, whether it's a radar technician, controller. Don't underestimate the psychographic issue of an individual who actually experienced combat. They don't know the norm. They've dealt with a very high stressful situation. They literally are relegated to a Neanderthal state. And when they come into this civilian site, it's very difficult for them to adjust. And you need to do something about that. And I'd be glad to give you some anecdotal evidence with more time. Thank you.
This idea of the deselective bias, would any of you want to comment on that? Have you experienced any of that? And I know, Mr. Grano, you mentioned you wanted to give some anecdotals, and I would certainly like to hear on some of the success stories.
I think there has been an attitude shift amongst the American people relative to veterans today versus Vietnam veterans returning. I vividly remember being in a hospital in the Bay with soldiers who were wounded along myself. Attitude, morale was spectacular. Once they left those hallowed halls and came into society, because of the controversy and the shift of attitude relative to the Vietnam War, they almost felt that they did the wrong thing by serving their country rather than the proper thing. I think that's different today. My middle managers don't have, in my view, a negative bias relative to a veteran. What I would like them to do, however, is to understand the value resource that they can provide, and I would like those assets, those human attributes, to allow a veteran at a point where they can compete with anyone, and I, for one, would break the tie in favor of veteran. But I do think you do have a branding issue, going to Wes's point. I think, without question, you've heard that veterans are acclimated relative to missions and goals and objectives. Veterans are already team players if they have to be team players. Veterans have experienced stress, crises, which come about in the private sector all the time, and they have a phenomenal work ethic, as one of the gentlemen had to say. On the con side, I think it's what I'm going to create a new term. When you're interviewing a veteran, that veteran suffers from what I'll call a formal Martinesque approach. Yes, sir, no, ma'am. And that's unusual in today's society. From dress-down days to the informality between management and employee puts them, in my view, at a disadvantage. Because that middle manager then says, well, wait a minute, can this person fit in with my team? We need to spend a bit of time with the veteran coming out as to what is the norm today. And I'd like to give you just one anecdotal experience. And again, I believe it is different from a veteran who's actually witnessed and experienced combat. And that's probably one of every 5. My brother was in the 101st Airborne in Vietnam, wounded as well. Had 6 months left on his ETS, and they sent him to Fort Lewis, Washington. He was a E7 sergeant, did very well. There a week, and a higher-ranking sergeant dressed him up and down for walking on grass. Now, I can assure you that a returning vet from Iraq doesn't understand your priority of whether or not you can walk on that grass, nor are they mentally capable. Have they been re-indoctrinated as to whether that's important or not? And his response was he went AWOL for a weekend and got drunk and busted. And I had a difficult time understanding why he'd do something so foolish until I went to Vietnam and came back. And then sitting at a dinner table with my parents, and I said, pass the expletive potatoes. And you have to understand, you have to detox. You are really relegated to a whole different form of humanity with the horrific side of war. And those veterans need more psychological understanding relative to what's the norm. And I think that would help more than anything in an interview process for the infantrymen.